My name is Sarah, and while I was in graduate school, I had taken on a babysitting job that would forever change my life. Little did I know that the innocent act of caring for a child would plunge me into a terrifying ordeal. It started with a seemingly ordinary evening, as I arrived at the address given to me by the agency, ready to take care of a sweet baby girl who we will call Emily. My job with the agency was only part-time and I didn't have a regular assignment. However, I had worked with Emily's family several times before and was asked to return to help them out when their regular babysitter was off. Emily was almost a year old, and her parents were an older couple who had tried for many years to have her but were unsuccessful. They finally decided to pursue surrogacy, and baby Emily was born through a surrogate. I arrived at the Johnson home about 15 minutes before my shift, which was scheduled to begin at 6 o'clock that evening. Mrs. Johnson, baby Emily's mom, greeted me at the door with the cheerful baby girl in hand. She thanked me for coming early and handed the baby to me before heading upstairs to begin getting dressed for her date night with her husband, Mr. Johnson. An hour after my arrival, the happy couple appeared once more to kiss Emily goodbye. They informed me that they had planned to be back home by 10 o'clock, and off they went. The first few hours passed uneventfully as Emily cooed and giggled in her crib. I had settled into a comfortable routine, unaware of the danger that lurked just outside of the main door of the Johnson residence. It was dark outside and extremely quiet. A nagging voice in the back of my mind whispered that something was not right. I dismissed it as mere paranoia, chalking it up to the fact that I hadn't been in the Johnson home in a few months. A half hour after Emily's parents' departure, the doorbell rang, a sound that echoed through the house, piercing the silence. My heart skipped a beat as I peered through the peephole, my hand trembling. There, on the other side, stood Mrs. Johnson, her eyes bloodshot and filled with desperation. I was so scared, I quickly opened the door, and when the door flung open, she ran upstairs to where Emily laid peacefully in her crib. Moments later, she yelled for me to call the police, and so I did. Mr. Johnson was nowhere in sight. Not even the car they had left in was anywhere in sight. The police showed up to the house almost immediately. The officers looked to me for an explanation as to why they were there, but I didn't have one to offer. I just led them to the nursery where Mrs. Johnson sat rocking back and forth holding Emily. She appeared to be in a trance as tears rolled down her cheeks. When she finally spoke, she said, "He's gone." The officers asked her to elaborate, and that's when she revealed that her and Mr. Johnson never made it out of the garage for their date night. What she said next sent chills down my spine. She told the officers that she had stabbed Mr. Johnson in the neck, causing him to bleed out. Call me naive, but it was after that admission that I noticed for the first time that Mrs. Johnson had blood on her hands and clothes. Everything happened so quickly, I had not noticed the blood until that point. The lone female officer in the group slowly removed Emily from Mrs. Johnson's grip. The other officer on the scene placed a very pale Mrs. Johnson under arrest. The baby was handed to me while the officers walked Mrs. Johnson to the garage where her husband was discovered slumped over the steering wheel of their newer model luxury SUV. I covered baby Emily's eyes as her mother was placed in the back of the squad car and her father taken away in a white sheet. The entire scene was horrific, and I watched as neighbor after neighbor gathered on the front lawn of the Johnson home. I took the baby inside and waited with officers who arrived on the scene later. I held Emily as her sweet innocent face smiled and giggled at me. The officers took my statement, which offered very little help, I'm sure. After about 15 minutes, Mr. Johnson's sister arrived on the scene and took a hold of the baby. She thanked me for keeping her niece safe but looked to me for answers about what happened to her brother. Again, I didn't have much to offer and told her exactly what I had told the police. The officers allowed me to pack a bag for the baby before marking the home off as a crime scene. I went home that night with many questions. The main question that riddled my mind was how such a seemingly happy couple could end up in a situation like this. A few days passed and I called to check on baby Emily and of course to offer my services as a babysitter if needed. It was then that I learned that earlier in the day that Mr. Johnson passed away, his wife had learned of his affair with the surrogate who carried Emily and she had plotted to harm him that evening in the garage. I was stunned because the smile Mrs. Johnson wore when I arrived at the home that evening offered no indication of what was to come. I was asked to testify at her trial, and although I knew what she did was wrong, I felt sorry for Mrs. Johnson as I looked at her from where I sat as a witness. Thank you for listening and stay spooked.
This story happened a few years ago while I was babysitting a set of 4-year-old twins from the neighborhood who we will call Lily and Ethan. Lily and Ethan were the sweetest children a babysitter could ask for. They were almost too perfect, and I enjoyed my time with them every time I babysat them. On this specific night, their mom, who was newly separated from their dad, had planned to go out for a few hours. I didn't really know much their parents' separation, but Ethan had mentioned it the last time I babysat them. Lily had also mentioned that she missed her father very much. The children's mother, who we will call Tammy, left the house that evening after being picked up by a handsome guy. Her date opened the passenger door for her, and she got in. The children waved goodbye as the car she left in drove away. Across the street, I noticed a black car with dark tints. The person inside wasn't visible. The kids and I did an arts and craft project, which took about 30 minutes. While the kids hung their artwork to dry, I looked outside again to see the car across the street still parked there. The door swung open and a tall man walked towards the house. As the man walked closer to the house, I recognized him as the twins' father. "Daddy," they both screamed. I hadn't noticed that they were standing behind me. He knocked on the door, and without hesitation, I opened. The kids ran into his arms, and he squeezed them tightly. He sat on the couch for a few minutes before he asked if he could take them out for ice cream. I told him that I had to check with Tammy, and he insisted that he had already spoken to her. I reached for my phone to call Tammy, and he grabbed my arm and wrestled the phone from my hand. I am their father, and I don't need permission from Tammy or anyone else to take my children. The look in his eyes scared me. Within minutes, he was gone with the children and my cell phone. I ran to a neighbor's house and asked to borrow their phone to call 911. It turns out that the neighbor had known something that I didn't. She was pacing back and forth saying the kids were in danger and that Tammy would freak out if she knew. She called Tammy, who showed up at the same time the police did. I explained what happened and more cops began coming to the scene. Tammy looked angrily at me, and I noticed quickly that the kids shouldn't have been with their father. I learned that her ex, the twins' father, was abusive, and she had been forced to get a restraining order to remove him from the home and stop him from seeing the children. She hadn't told me out of embarrassment and fear of judgment. I'm not gonna lie, I was annoyed that she hadn't told me because telling me could have saved all the drama that happened that night. I called my mom and asked her to track the location of my phone using hers because we always shared locations. She was able to track down where my phone was, which ultimately gave the cops the address for where the kids were with their father. He was arrested that night and the kids were returned to their mother. Since that day, I was never called to babysit the twins again, but I am happy they were found safe and sound.
This story was sent to us from Anna in Scottsdale. When our children were younger, my husband and I decided that it would be a good idea to hire a nanny. We had 3 small children, and it was a lot of work to manage everything. We interviewed more than 30 nannies before we decided on one. We will call our nanny Rose. Rose was a woman in her mid-20s. We thought she would be a good fit because she had a degree in early childhood development. She came from a big family with lots of younger siblings whom she cared for. She also spoke 3 languages. We were quite impressed by her background. Rose settled into our family very quickly, and the kids seemed to adapt to her quite well. She had her own apartment in our basement. We allowed her to drive one of extra cars for her personal use. She was working with us for about 3 months when I noticed something strange. She would be withdrawn and get very quiet sometimes. She mentioned once that she took medication, but I never asked her what for. I told my husband that I felt Rose was being strange, but then he brushed it off and told me I was overreacting. Our youngest was only 2 years old, and he was in the process of being potty trained. Rose seemed very patient when I would watch her with him. Sometimes she seemed to have more patience than me. We slowly noticed, though, that he was withdrawn from her a bit. It was very strange because he really liked her in the beginning. I suggested to my husband that we set up cameras in the common areas of our home and in the kids' bedrooms. One day while watching the cameras, we noticed that our youngest child had an accident. Rose screamed at him, and when he started crying, she threw him down. He cried for about 30 minutes, and she ignored him the entire time. We confronted her with the evidence and called the police. She was arrested, and we found out from the police a lot of new information that we didn't know before hiring her. The name that she had given us was changed from her original name about a year before. She had told us that she didn't have any kids, which wasn't true. She had 3 children whom she lost custody of because she abused them. We even learned that she had intentionally burned one of her children's fingers. She suffered from bipolar disorder, and her ex-husband said she threatened to kill him. The 3 languages that she spoke were learned during the 2 years she spent in an international prison for trafficking drugs. After Rose left, I was cleaning the basement apartment and I found a diary under her pillow. I opened the diary and I read entries she made about harming me and my children. She wrote about how much she hated my family and thought we had a perfect life that we didn't deserve. She fantasized about poisoning me and my family. She even wrote about how she would dispose of us so she can live in our home with her own children and husband someday while we rotted away. After this experience, I felt so guilty because we had not done a formal background check on her, but instead, we just simply called her references. We decided never to use a nanny again, and instead I quit my job to stay home with our children. I am not saying that all nannies are bad, but a background check should be mandatory before allowing someone into your home. Thank you for listening. Stay spooked.